European Commission and the European Parliament offices in the UK. There are offices like this in all capitals of the member states. Needless to say that after the 29th of March, after Brexit, we, the Commission, will no longer be here. Instead, the EU's Foreign Service, the so-called External Action Service, will be representing the EU to the UK then, presumably also in this office.
So you're going to have a name change. Functionally, it's still going to be representative of...
It's still going to be representatives of the EU. It's going to be more than just a name change. Basically, because when the UK becomes a third country, which is what we call countries outside who are not members, the EU representation here will become a full-blown embassy. We call them delegations, that's the technical term. So a representation is the offices inside the member state capitals, inside the member states. Outside the member states, it is called a delegation. And there are delegations in most capitals of the world.
Interesting.
Yes, but their role will be different. I mean, similar in some respects, but also different. I want to tell you a bit about the EU's history and about the institutions, and then about what we do here, the job of the representation. I wasn't planning to talk about Brexit very much. I'm happy to answer some of your questions. Whatever's on my slides here is now way out of date anyway, because it's, the slides aren't very new, and it's a very fast moving area. So the EU is still made up of 28 member states, with a population of just over 500 million and 24 official languages. The languages are important in the sense that all official documents from the EU need to be translated into all these 24 languages, even though the working languages tend to be English, French, and to a lesser extent German. But once something is published, a new law available to the public, it needs to be translated into all these 24 languages. When did the EU start? I don't want to bore you with the really basic things, but it's important to remember that it did come out of the Second World War, and what caused not only the Second but both World Wars. And the aim, in the words of the then French minister Schuman, was to make war not only unthinkable but materially impossible. Specifically with a reference to France and Germany, because it's those two countries that started both world wars. To make war materially impossible, what was done was the creation of the so-called European Coal and Steel Community. That is the predecessor, or the kind of the origin of the EU, established by the Treaty of Paris in 1951. There were 6 member states: France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. And as the name suggests, this was about pooling resources and pooling decision-making power over coal and steel. Why coal and steel? Because those are the two resources you most need in order to produce weapons and make war. So the idea was that if you pool the decision-making over those resources, making war would become materially difficult, and not just a philosophical concept that it would be nice to live in peaceful times. The coal and steel community then transformed quite quickly into the so-called European Economic Community, the EEC, established by the Treaty of Rome in 1957. The same 6 member states began this, and it introduced concepts like the customs union, which is a very important pillar of the EU to this day. It removes internal tariffs, it makes trade simpler and cheaper between member states. And it also already then introduced the common agricultural policy, essentially a program of agricultural subsidies that were hitherto only national, and now they were transnational between those 6 member states. now we do a big jump, not that nothing happened in the meantime, but in terms of the treaties, I'm taking you through the main treaties here. We jumped to 1985 and the Schengen Agreement. What the Schengen Agreement did was to abolish internal borders. So this is about not just goods passing the border without having to pay customs duties, but people crossing the borders without any checks. Not all member states were happy about this, and to this day there are countries in the EU who chose not to join Schengen, so they're colour-coded. You can see the UK and Ireland are both not in Schengen, and also those ones in green down there, Romania, Bulgaria and our most recent member Croatia, are Schengen candidate countries. That means they would like to join, but the other members have so far said they're not quite ready. Just to make it a little bit more complicated, there are a small number of non-EU member countries who are also part of Schengen, so it is open to non-EU members, and in this particular instance we are talking about Norway, Iceland and Switzerland. Schengen made travelling for Europeans a lot easier, but it's not only leisure travelling, it is also business travel very much in mind. People who travel across, there are people who travel across borders every day for their work, for example. In 1986, the Single European Act created what is now known as the single market. Sometimes it's also referred to as the internal market. Those two terms are essentially interchangeable. It provides for the free movement of goods, services, capital and persons. And it's important to remember that there are these four items, four freedoms, separate freedoms, but which come as a package as far as the EU is concerned. So if a member state says, we like the free movement of goods and services, but we're not too keen on the free movement of people, we don't want all these European migrants coming, that doesn't work, because you cannot have one without the other. I won't go into the reasons for explaining this. Safe to say that there are both economic and political reasons why this is like that. The next big treaty, and this really was a big one, is the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. That created the euro. The currency didn't come into circulation for another 10 years, but it created the EMU, the European Monetary Union, where countries began to pool their monetary policies, in particular interest rates, and also the exchange rates already started to be fixed from that point onwards. It did a whole raft of other things, and in terms of what we now call the European Union, that actually only started in 1992. It went from the EEC, the European Economic Community, to the European Union. You will note they left out the word economic, perhaps as a sign to make it obvious to everybody that the way we are moving is that this is no longer only a community of shared economic interests, but this is now also about shared political interests. And arguably it always was. They've just made that more explicit. Which brings us to the most recent treaty, the Lisbon Treaty of 2007, which also changed the game quite fundamentally. It introduced a lot more majority decision making in the Council, and I'll come to the different EU institutions in a minute just to make clear what they all are. The Council is where member states meet and discuss and decide things. And they tend to decide things either by unanimity or by a majority decision. And there are so-called rules for a qualified majority to make sure it's absolutely fair and that big countries can't always bully small ones and so on. The Council still prefers to take decisions by unanimity where it can, for obvious reasons. Politically, it's always easier to sell an idea if you can say everyone has agreed. But the rules now allow for an increasing number of areas to be decided by majority decision, and that was, you know, I mean, it continues to be controversial. But basically, whenever somebody's unhappy, they don't want to be outvoted, obviously. But the counter argument is that if you always strive for unanimity, you never get anything done, especially as the membership expands. And the 28 members, it is quite difficult to achieve unanimity. The other big change the Lisbon Treaty brought about is that the European Parliament, which is the co-legislator with the Council, becomes an equal co-legislator. Up until then, it kind of took a... it was also a legislator, but it had more a role of rubber stamping what the Council had effectively already decided. I'm oversimplifying this, but they were formally not equal in terms of their power, whereas the Lisbon Treaty made them equal. The reason they did this was to answer the criticism of a lack of popular consent, of lack of democratic legitimacy, because only the European Parliament is a directly elected body, whereas the other European bodies EU bodies are not. It also established two new offices, the President of the European Council and the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. I won't go into this now, but basically these are two figureheads now, which are chosen for a period of 4 years. It proposes legislation, and once that legislation is decided by the legislators, is voted on, amended, but finally agreed, it is then the role of the Commission to enforce that legislation. So on the one hand, it proposes legislation in draft form, and on the other, it enforces legislation once it's been passed by the legislators. And our current President is Jean-Claude Juncker. The way European Commission presidents are appointed is a little complicated, has also changed over time. It relates to the political party groups who sit in the European Parliament. And basically each group, so there's a centre-right group, a centre-left group, and everything around those two groups, they each choose a candidate who they want to be European Commission president, and they vote internally on those things. And whoever comes out top in the European elections, usually either the EPP, which is the centre-right group, or the SNP, which is the centre-left group, they will then field the European Commission president. And they try to integrate that into the European election campaign, which, by the way, there's another election in May next year. And we don't currently know who the new Commission president is going to be, we don't even know who the candidates are yet. The European Parliament has 2 seats in Brussels and Strasbourg, currently presided by Antonio Tajani. It is the directly elected body of the EU. It is elected every 5 years, and as I said earlier, it is an equal co-legislator with the Council. It works like all parliaments do, except, I mean, if you compare it to the British Parliament, you actually notice that there's a huge amount of difference. The rules are very, very clear in the European Parliament. I say this because I've been following parliamentary debate for the last 5 days, and there is so much going on here, and it's quite difficult to understand sometimes what's going on or to predict what's going to happen next. That's because the British Constitution is not a written constitution, it is a constitution based on convention, and that includes how Parliament works. So if you're trying to understand how Parliament works and what it might do next, there is no single book where you can look, these are the rules. You have to look in history books and see what's happened before and why, and how this might be applicable this time round, or not. And in many ways, whenever the British Parliament enters a sort of something quite new, it's very exciting because nobody really knows what's going to happen. Not so with the European Parliament. Perhaps more boring, but at least it's kind of more clear what's actually going on. So the Council of the EU, also usually referred to as the Council of Ministers, that is the other legislator in the EU. It represents member states, so it is where national ministers meet to discuss. It is a single institution but it meets in different formations. I think between 10 and 12 different formations depending on the subject. So there is an Economic and Financial Affairs Council, there is a Foreign Affairs Council, there is an Environment Council, there is a Competitiveness Council that deals with business issues. So each time the relevant ministers from each country attend these to decide on legislative proposals tabled by the Commission and to discuss things in a more general manner. The Council of Ministers has a rotating presidency that lasts only 6 months. It is no longer Bulgaria, it is currently Austria, and I think the next ones will be Romania. It changes in January and then again in June. What the rotating presidency does is essentially it acts as the chairman for these council meetings, and they don't get more power, legislatively speaking, but they have an agenda-setting power. So member states generally value this rotating presidency a lot, which is why when the Lisbon Treaty was introduced, which introduced the permanent council presidency, member states were reluctant to give up the rotating one because of the agenda-setting power that it gives them. So both systems were kept and are currently running in parallel. So the European Council, just to make things complicated, is not the same as the Council of Ministers. The European Council is the highest level policy-making body. That means it is where the heads of state meet. Whether that's the President or the Prime Minister depends on which country we're talking about. But it is where the leaders of countries meet. They make top-level decisions. They don't bother with detailed legislative files. They don't negotiate much either. They tend to speak at very high level and give the political guidance to the individual councils and to the other institutions and to the Commission. I mean, ultimately to everybody in the EU to decide where things should go next. It usually meets 4 times a year in a formal capacity. In reality, there are quite a few more informal meetings. The most recent one we had was in October, which was all about Brexit. I'm talking about on the 25th of November. It was meant to be October, and then it was November. They convened a special European Council to discuss the terms of the Brexit deal and to sign it off ultimately. The next regular European Council is on the 13th and 14th of December. So these were the main decision-making institutions I've just talked about. The European Court of Justice is another one that is important, not for the policy making, but for interpreting EU law, for ensuring everyone abides by the same, not just by the same rules, but that everybody interprets the rules in the same way. So when either the European Commission or a member state takes issue with the way a particular policy is being implemented or not implemented, they usually go to the European Court of Justice as the final arbiter. I mean, it is a bit like the Supreme Court, except Supreme Courts, whether in the US or in the UK, tend to have an even wider role. I mean, the remit of the ECJ is a bit more narrowly defined. But the most important thing to retain is the highest decision-making authority in the EU, traditionally speaking. The central bank, based in Frankfurt, does what central banks do. It sets the interest rate for the euro area, and it has policies to ensure financial stability and macroprudential policy. I don't know how much you want to go into central bank stuff. I'm not an expert. I know the basics. I think it's it's only natural that with a single currency you have a central bank. Importantly, perhaps in terms of the relationship between member states and the EU, is that while member states, even member states who have the euro, they retain their national central banks, so the German Bundesbank continues to exist, but it doesn't take interest rate decisions anymore, and there's a whole load of other decisions it doesn't take anymore. It still carries a lot of responsibility for supervision of banks in their own countries, the national central banks do, but usually with reference to some EU law or guideline from the European Central Bank. So here you see the institution in a chart that shows a little bit how they fit together. I haven't mentioned the Court of Auditors, just to cut things short a little bit. I mean, they do what auditors do to make sure financial propriety is always maintained. And the two advisory bodies at the bottom are significant in the sense that they do provide advice to both the European Parliament and the Council, but they are not decision-making bodies or executive bodies, therefore I haven't talked about them. But if you're interested, it's all online. So that brings me to our office here. We have, well, as I said at the start, there is a representation of the Commission in all member states. In the UK, we actually have 4 offices: London, Belfast, Cardiff, and Edinburgh. This is to reflect the nature of the British state, the United Kingdom, I should say, because a lot of powers have been devolved from Westminster to Edinburgh, Belfast, and Cardiff. And to be able to follow those things closely, we have people there, and also to be able to speak to people, because as you may also know, if you follow the referendum debate and the Brexit debate, there is quite a difference in opinion in those 4 constituent parts of the UK on what Brexit should be, or whether it should be at all, and so on and so forth. So in terms of our role, we are legally and technically not an embassy, and we don't get diplomatic status or any of those things. However, our structure and many of our functions are quite similar to what embassies do, and we do mingle a lot with diplomats from the EU27 embassies, because we go to the same government briefings where government will tell us, UK government will tell us what they think about issue X, Y, Z, and people will ask questions and respond, and ultimately then everybody goes back to their desks and writes a little report for their respective governments, and we write a report for our masters in Brussels. I've already said we have representation in all member states, and that after Brexit the representation in the UK will turn into a so-called delegation managed by the EEAS, External Action, European External Action Service. When people ask me what we do here, I've always tended to explain it as a sort of two-way radio function. On the one hand, it's an outgoing function, so communicating policies and whatever else the EU is trying to do to the UK public, and by that I mean not just the general public, but specifically stakeholder groups, business organisations, people who work in government, trade unions, lobby groups, special interest groups, all these people. The general public we also speak to, but by and large the level of interest is lower compared to business groups who will have a specific concern or something that they're pushing for, or something that they're trying to prevent in terms of EU policy. And if they're based in the UK, their first port of call is here. We will hopefully be in a position to tell them what's what, and we will importantly take their messages and concerns and convey them to the relevant people in Brussels. So that is the second function of the job. It is listening to what's happening on the ground here and reporting that back to the Commission. That could include things, general political and economic developments, as is the case with everything relating to Brexit now, what's going on in Parliament. We report to Brussels regularly on all that every week, and it could also be policy specific. And admittedly, there was a lot more of that policy-specific work going on before the 2016 referendum, when the people like me working here would specialise in certain policy areas. So I would cover employment and social policy, business regulation, all the stuff around SMEs and digital economy. So people with those concerns, working in those areas, would usually come to me, and I would either be able to answer their questions directly, or if I'm not, I would know where to find the answer. In terms of our structure, I mean, we have a political sector and a press office. We have a communication sector that also deals with the general public a lot more. You know, public information centres in libraries, and we organise and fund. Yeah, that's basically it. And admin and finance is exactly what it says on the tin. As I've said, I'm happy to answer your questions on Brexit.